And I'm like, oh my gosh. Like, first thing is, this is working.
We kind of went ballistic. We kind of went bananas on that. It's like, are you kidding me?
So then people ordered more of Spawn. And Spawn did the same thing. It came out, sold out. Savage Dragon came out, sold out. And just each book kind of did better than the last.
I was 11, 12 years old, and all these other books I've been reading had such history. This was something I could get in on the ground floor of, and I could be there from day one, and that really excited me.
We put that finger on that pulse of what the audience, wanted, and we were just very fortunate that it was what we wanted too.
Matt, before you mentioned you're being hired, can you tell that story? Actually, each one of you tell the story how you actually came into this group.
My story is a little weird because people tend to hate on me when they hear it. I didn't really read comics. I wasn't really into them at all. And I got dragged to the signing at Mile High Comics in '93 by my nephew, who was 8. And he's like, I like these comic things. You gotta take this thing. I'm like, my sister finally begged me to do it. And so I take my nephew down, and he's like, oh, it's a 2. I don't remember what time it was, but we got there right when it started. He's like, no, we have to get there early. There's gonna be a big line. I'm like, whatever. It's a comic book. And so we get there, and there's a 3-hour line. I remember waiting in this line for 3 hours, and that was the day that I was literally standing in line right behind Jonathan Sabal, who is a name you might recognize, a very prominent inker in comics, does a lot of Marvel and DC works, and was one of the early image inkers that inked Rob Liefeld. And so I stood in a line behind this guy for 3 hours, who was there to show his portfolio to Rob, and he was just telling me all this about comic history and how exciting it was, and all these people in line. And I was working at a bank, a menial job, and I hated it. And so I got up to the front of the line, and finally got in. I saw here these 8 guys with all these black leather jackets on. They all say Extreme Studios. It's Eric Stevenson, Kurt Hathaway, Richard Ory, and some of these guys from Rob Liefeld, who I recognized from his TV career. That's the only reason I knew who he was. And so I got up. John was right in front of me, showed his portfolio to Rob, and they were so excited to have a dialogue. And Rob hired the guy. He's like, "Hey, Jonathan, you're awesome. Come back with us behind the table. You're hired." And I'm sitting there. Fuck. And I'm like, here's this guy who's been hanging out for 3 hours and gets hired on the spot, and I was the next guy. And Rob's like, oh, hey, man. And I'm like, I don't draw, but are you looking for anyone else? And he's like, yeah, we need somebody to do letters pages, write press releases. Can you do that? I'm like, shit, yeah. And I went the next day and bought a book on how to write a press release. I wrote a press release, plagiarized straight out of that book. I faxed it over to Eric Stevenson. I popped into their office about a week later, and here it's 20 years later. So,
I hate you.
How'd you get hired, Eric?
I was there, dude.
Oh, I mean, in comics.
In comics?
Yeah.
You want to go back that far? In the craft administration? No, I mean, me and a bunch of friends self-published a comic book way before Image Comics. And it had the dragon in it, my character. And from that, self-publishing this fanzine that was just distributed through my local comic store up in Bellingham, Washington, I just sent copies out to everybody I could think who might possibly want to do something. And we sold some stuff through the mail, and a couple of guys who wanted to start up their own comic companies contacted me about doing some work for them, and that was kind of the little thing that got me going. And each time you did any little job, I would just send out copies to everybody else. Eventually I met Jim Shooter at a Chicago con. He was Marvel's editor-in-chief at the time. And at that point, I had sent him stuff over and over and over again. And so he knew my name, and he had known my work, and he flipped through and asked if I wanted to do something over at Marvel, something for Marvel Fanfare. And I thought, wow, Marvel Fanfare, I'm already a Fanfare. And it was like, Marvel Fanfare was code for, would you like to do an inventory story that's going to sit around for a couple of years? It's like, okay. And so the two of us plotted the story at the convention, and I went home and drew it, and that was like my best everything, because it was really catered to what I did well. It was completely playing to all of my strengths. It was just two guys kicking the shit out of each other for 22 pages. And that just got me in all kinds of doors at that point. I had done DNA didn't Silver Eclipse, and then that led to me doing the Doom Patrol over at PC, and then that led to Punisher, and then Marvel Comics Presents, and then Amazing Spider-Man over at Marvel. And there's just one thing after another, you just climb up that ladder. And when it came to Image Comics, me, Rob Liefeld, and Jim Valentino had gone out to dinner with Dave Albrecht from Malibu, and Rob was asking Dave, hey, would you publish a comic by me? And it's like, yeah, of course I would. I'd publish a comic by any of you guys, because he was doing like these crappy black and white comics that were coming out at that point. And Rob was really just curious as to see if he had done a comic for somebody else, whether the audience who was following him over Marvel, would those guys check it out? Would they buy it? And eventually what he ended up doing is he had put an ad in the Comics Buyer's Guide of just a pinup of these guys and saying, this thing's happening. The executioners are coming. And then Marvel just flipped their wig when they saw this ad, because they were like, these look just like your Marvel characters. And it's like, well, they were still drawn by Rob, so they all kind of, anyway, they went ape, and at that point, it was like blood in the water. You could sort of smell the fear, you know, and it's like, hey, I think there's